Okay, let's begin. Thank you very much for coming. Good afternoon and welcome to this session on the WSIS+10 review and the multi-stakeholder model. My name is Peter Dengate Thrush. I'm originally the chairman of Internet New Zealand, which makes policy and gives policy advice on the internet to the New Zealand government, and also runs the New Zealand CCTLD. After that, I became the chairman of the APTLD, the Asia Pacific Association, and I'm the immediate past chairman of ICANN. So I've been involved in internet governance, institutions and internet governance building since 1995, and I'm spending my time now focusing in this particular area of global internet governance, trying to make sure and trying to help the internet and the institutions that we've built up over these years maintain their position and keep the internet, as Kathy and others have said, open and available to all. And this is a critical time for global internet governance, as many of you will know. And to talk about it today, we've assembled an absolutely stellar panel. First of all, noting with some pleasure the gender balance that was talked about, but also the skills balance. And without going into great detail, we've got luminaries here from academia, from business, from civil society, from government, and from the technical community, which are all really the major planks of the multi-stakeholder community. And so we'll be taking you through some discussion about the global internet governance scene, but with a great deal of attention paid on the WSIS, the World Summit on the Information Society, and the fact that it's being reviewed, what it means, how did we get here, and we're going to finish with a little discussion about how you might get further involved in this very important process. So we thought it might be a good way to start by having someone who was intimately involved in leading the US government delegation at the time the WSIS was formed. And that's former Ambassador David Grace. So I'm going to ask David. David, could you kick off with a description really of what the WSIS was, what it meant, and where did it get to?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be back with you all. I appreciate it. And looking out at the audience, I'll try to keep this pretty brief because so many of you are so expert in all the minutiae about the history as well as the current situation with regard to the World Summit of the Information Society. I had the great privilege of leading the U.S. delegation, of which many people here were part of, for the creation of the WSIS, both in 2003, the Geneva phase, and 2005, the Tunisia stage. But the origins of it really begin, well, one could argue even longer ago, but certainly in 1998 at the International Telecommunications Union, the expert group within the United Nations family that at its plenipotentiary in Minneapolis in 1998 passed a resolution 73 which called for a potential summit. I would say it's probably fair to say that the U.S., although we were the host of that plenipotentiary, was not wildly enthusiastic about the idea of the United Nations playing an active role in what might be viewed as setting the rules for the internet. Back then, the Clinton administration was very much in the global leadership on policy making and believing that the internet was best left as little regulated as possible, and to the extent it was regulated, that regulation should be bottoms up, what we now sometimes think of as multi-stakeholder. Fast forward to end of 2001, which is when I became involved. The General Assembly at the United Nations thought this was a great idea. In fact, it should be a heads of state summit, which in the UN world is as big as it gets. Because in sort of somewhat typical fashion, international fashion, it was two countries wanted to host it, and no one wanted to decide which of the two should host it. They decided to do both. So that's how we came to have one in 2003 and one in 2005. The actual General Assembly resolution, which is available, of course, online, is actually very interesting. The one that was adopted at the end of December 2001, because as is probably very familiar to all of you, just like we're about to do with the current WSIS review. The preparatory work was to be an open-ended intergovernmental preparatory committee, intergovernmental being the operative term. But it did, in light of other activities that have been going on at the UN, encourage contributions and activities by non-governmental organizations, civil society, private sector, to contribute to the preparatory work. This set up probably the first set of scars that I have on my back from this process, because there was a fair bit of confusion as a result of this, where the UN, in preparing for a summit, of course, looks to governments to negotiate, and only governments to negotiate. So the first question, of course, was what were we negotiating about and who was allowed to be in the room? This being 2002, when we first really started, the answer was governments only. And we would be talking about things that the UN is most comfortable, which is not technology, but human rights, financing for development, and those types of issues. Not surprisingly, the U.S., together with some of our European colleagues, fought very hard to try to get others into the room. Eventually, that was successful. We were trying to be subversive by trying to have as large a delegation with as many parts, including civil society, the private sector, in there as well. It was a very difficult negotiation, even for 2003, which people often forget, the Geneva phase. We needed an extra PrepCom just before the actual conference itself. And most of the most contentious issues, which at that point turned out to be internet governance related, something you all would be particularly interested in, was so controversial that we ultimately couldn't decide them, in part because we couldn't even figure out what the term internet governance meant. So we created a specialized group, the WIGIG, to study that between the 2003 and 2005 phase of the summit. We did come up with a very strong document, I think, for the Geneva phase of the summit. But that really set up the battle for the following 2 years to get ready for the 2005 Tunis. Of course, the irony of having a internet-related free flow of information focused, to some degree, at least for us, summit in Tunisia, particularly since Ben Ali was a very strong and bad dictator of the country, did not go unnoticed, particularly by civil society. That created a whole series of issues prior to the conference and at the conference itself. These turned out to be very large, amongst the very largest of UN summits ever held in terms of attendance, and also some of the most controversial because of the issue of press freedom and the like. I got hauled up in Tunis by the foreign minister of Tunisia to be yelled at because we had given a talk about the importance of free flow of information, because reporters were being beat up, civil society was not being able to participate fully. It was a very, very difficult process. It was not clear until basically the night before the start of the summit whether or not we'd even have a summit declaration. And ultimately, what we've all come to love, the Internet Governance Forum, was born out of that late night session where we and others would not agree to fundamental changes in the way in which ICANN was governed and others. And we created an agreement to talk about enhanced cooperation, which set the following 10 years to debate what the hell that meant, together with the Internet Governance Forum. I will note, sort of in closing, because we have so much to talk about, probably for me, the most interesting part of the Internet Governance Forum was, if you look at, I think it's paragraph 77, which is part of the operative terms about the Internet Governance Forum, you'll never see a short paragraph have the word no in it as many times as you will there. And that's because I personally insisted that the word no show up almost everywhere, because the concern, the legitimate concern, was that what the Internet Governance Forum would be an annual WSIS summit, that we would be negotiating endlessly over these very difficult issues in an environment that would just create a never-ending uncertainty. So I wanted to, and others, but particularly I have to admit I was the troublesome person in the room, insisted that it be a non-decision-making venue for exchange of information. It was not easy to explain that, and I will say that most people were very skeptical about the Internet Governance Forum. They were unhappy with it when we came out and explained that was the agreement. I fast forward to today. It has been an extraordinary success and a great testament to many of the people here in this room and others about how successful it has been. But let me tell you, back in 2005, it certainly was not clear that that was going to be a very successful part, and I got taken to task a lot for helping to create it. So bottom line, and particularly looking ahead to the WSIS review, the major issues that were there and ones that I would expect to always be there. Financing for development was a big issue for both phases and continued, I think, to be a major issue that we would expect to see going forward. Human rights issues that includes free flow of information and the like, critically important, and I think many people felt unsatisfied by the results. Certainly civil society was very unsatisfied by the results of both phases of WSIS, but particularly phase one of that. And then, of course, the ongoing issue about the nature, scope, and future of the Internet Governance Forum. So with that, let me maybe close, but that's a very short version of Laura's very lengthy and good book on Internet governance.
Thank you, David, for a fact-filled and brief. Thank you for that analysis of where we started from. And can I just come back to one of your points? The rest of the world was really very grateful and has benefited greatly from the US leadership in this particular fight. Things that perhaps we take for granted, such as freedom of speech and the right of association, etc. These things were brought into this process, and we've all around the world benefited. And one of the obvious beneficiaries is civil society as a group, which is able to participate. And I'm going to turn now to one of the members of civil society. Matthew, you've been participating more recently in some of the debates as this review has gone on, including recent consultations in New York. Can you bring us up to speed about where we're standing at the moment with the review?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So, as David said, in 2005 we had the Tunis agenda was released, which was the outcome document of that session of the WSIS. And in that document it calls for a 10-year review, and that's what's happening this year. Why is it important? There are a number of, the world has changed since 2005. It's important because many of the elements that were in the WSIS document remain true today, but many of them have changed and have evolved from then. So what the review is actually about, it's actually about looking at the outcomes of the implementation of the WSIS at the end of this year. It's not actually about the WSIS documents themselves. And so it's actually going to look at what has changed, how the action lines, the various elements within the WSIS, within the Tunis agenda and the Geneva action line, how have they evolved over time? What kind of an impact have they had? And how, if at all, might they evolve further in the future? Many things have changed in between. We've got, this year is a particularly important year. We've got the INA transition, as we discussed this morning. We've got the new Sustainable Development Goals, and we've got the WSIS review. And it's all coming together more or less in the same space, and it's going to have various implications. The review itself will be, well, I'll talk about the review itself. The review itself will be an intergovernmental review, but the meeting will be an intergovernmental review, but there will be opportunities to contribute and participate in that meeting from other stakeholders. The process for getting there was kicked off formally on the 1st and 2nd of July with an intergovernmental meeting in New York and then a non-governmental stakeholder meeting on the 2nd. And that process is now ramping up over the next months through to December. The most important, I think, as Kathy Brown and somebody else mentioned earlier on, one of the most important kind of deadlines that you should keep in mind is the 31st of July, which is the first opportunity to contribute written statements to the WSIS process and to the eventual zero-day document that will evolve into the document that will be negotiated in New York. The other important date, so that's the first important date to bear in mind, 31st of July. The other important date is a potential other non-governmental stakeholder meeting that may be held in the September timeframe, October 16th, I think it is, 19th, October 19th, thank you. And that's another date to keep in mind in terms of participating New York or Geneva to be determined, I assume, and that will depend upon the new presidency of the General Assembly, which will come in September, which is going to be the Danes. So those are the two kind of key points if you're looking at this from key deadlines, if you're looking at this from a non-governmental stakeholder perspective. There is, as I said, there will be hopefully opportunities to participate in the two-day event in New York. Hopefully there will be opportunity to speak. Stakeholders are, in the modalities, encouraged to participate, which is encouraging. But at the same time, a lot is left to be desired. We have, over the past review, which is the 2 years leading up until last June 2014, over that period of that review, there's been a multi-stakeholder process that's been ongoing. And we, CDT, participated in this, as did many other organizations from business and civil society and everything else. And that process was very open. And that process was basically everybody sitting in a room, largely behaving and acting as equals, largely, being able to contribute to drafting documents, et cetera, et cetera. So that we made considerable strides from the year 2005 to the review process that we had over the past 2 years. And unfortunately, this part of the review process now moves into this intergovernmental phase, and that changes the dynamic a lot. It feels like we've, in a way, kind of stepped back a little bit. We don't have as much access as we had in the past. It's not as open as it was in the past. And you've heard others speaking about the importance of continuing to push for it to be opened up more as much as is possible. Some of the key issues, David's already alluded to some of them. In the meeting on the 1st of July in New York, when the government spoke, we saw many of the same issues come to the fore as we'd seen over the past 10 years. Obviously financing, obviously development issues, obviously internet governance issues. Some recognition, not a huge amount of recognition of the fact that good governance, enabling environments and competition and things like that have contributed to the changing environment in the internet, but some recognition of that. So we're going to see a replay in New York of many of those same issues, the degree to which is still a kind of an open issue. So there'll be a call for more funding, there'll be a call for more intergovernmental enhanced cooperation, hopefully there'll be a call for the IGF to be renewed, we'll be pushing for that. And there is a general recognition that somehow we need to get back to some of the really early intent of the WSIS, which was how do we harness and capture the potential of ICTs for development, and how do we do more of that? And I think that's one of the kind of the key messages that we have to think about going forward, and let me just touch upon a couple of them. What's really important in this process is that we not let some of the disagreements over internet governance issues get in the way of making the most of the linkages we can see between the WSIS review and the Sustainable Development Goals. Because these things are happening at the same time, and we need to be able to say, and we need to be able to push the agenda that says ICTs are incredibly important for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And that needs to be, I think, one of our biggest messages in this process and biggest points to leverage. So we really need to be careful that the discussions on enhanced cooperation, which we have not been able to agree for the past 10 years, make sure that they don't get in the way of really pushing for ICTs for development. The other big question is going to be multi-stakeholder versus multilateral. And I think we want to talk a little bit more about multi-stakeholder processes as well on this panel, but that discussion is going to come to the fore again. It seems to me that we need to still get much more concrete, much more practical in what we mean by multi-stakeholder. Okay? It's really important that we do that, and we spend some time, spending a lot of time on doing that when we go into this meeting in New York, and then looking beyond that. There'll be a whole host of other issues that have been raised before, cybersecurity, privacy, and other things. We already saw in the G77 statement that was made on the 1st of July, pushing on the issues of cybersecurity, pushing on the issues of privacy. We'll see those come back to the fore. I think the important thing for us is also, and maybe we can talk about this later, is what happens post-2015? How would we like to see the environment evolve? Surely we don't want another 10 years of debating issues that we can't agree on. Maybe how do we move beyond that, and how do we evolve beyond that? I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Excellent bringing us up to speed, and particularly the focus on multi-stakeholder. You've got to remember that this is still, although we've been living with it and fighting it for many years, in many places it's a brand new concept. It's alien to many forms of government, and it doesn't even translate particularly well into some of the languages that we have to work with. So,
sorry,
do you want to come back to
just
that?
a plug. Marilyn distributed this. This is the roadmap that leads up to the December meeting in New York. So there are a number of things on that I've just outlined.
Yes, that's great. So do pick that up, and I think some of the other speakers are going to refer to that and highlight some of the aspects of that. Can we turn then to another group that benefited greatly from the opening up of this process from being purely governmental, and that of course is business. I'm very pleased to introduce Carolyn Nguyen from Microsoft, who's been Microsoft and Carolyn have been involved in this process for an awfully long time. Carolyn, you took part, I think, in as a business representative in the discussions at the United Nations on the 2nd of July. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and about Microsoft's role in this?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Peter. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Can you hear me now? Great, thank you. And David and Matthew did a really great job of setting the context and also some of the issues. And I completely concur with Matthew that we absolutely need to focus the discussion on broader than just internet governance. It is about how to use and leverage ICT and the experience that we've gained over the past 10 years and beyond to accomplish some of the goals in the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is to that I will focus most of my remarks today. Peter mentioned that I had participated in the UN event on July 2nd, so I'll be sharing much of the same comments, which is entirely about raising awareness of how business has embraced multi-stakeholder. So it's very much the practical angle in terms of how multi-stakeholder has enabled us to achieve the WSIS action lines in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then based on those practical experience from Microsoft, some thoughts on what still needs to be done. So as part of Microsoft's mission to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more, we are focused entirely on creating innovative ICT solutions and initiatives that are inclusive and helps to realize the full potential of the peoples around the world, while enabling sustainable social and economic development entirely through partnerships and working with local business, governments, civil society, and others in countries where we operate. By ICT, I want to spend a little bit of time to expand on this. We don't just mean the technology, but also a more holistic and layered framework to bridge the digital divide. There are two components. One which focuses on affordable and universal access to broadband services and the internet, and then the capacity building locally that are needed to enable not just adoption, but also production and consumption of localized contents and services through training for young people, especially girls, and disadvantaged populations, along with support for local small and medium-sized enterprises. I will share 3 specific examples, 1 in access and 2 in capacity building. An example of a multi-stakeholder project in access and community empowerment is our Mwingu project to deliver low-cost wireless broadband access to previously unserved locations near Nanyuki, Kenya. The 2013 project was developed in partnerships with the Government of Kenya's Ministry of ICT, with a local Kenyan telecommunications operator, and a Nanyuki-based systems integrator in conjunction with USAID, and strongly shaped by input from the local communities. It utilizes the TV white space technology that Microsoft developed, which enables low-cost yet long-range broadband connectivity, and uses solar panels to provide power for the base stations and for charging devices that are used to eliminate the need for an electricity infrastructure. Connected organizations include a school, a farm, library, government offices, and a local Red Cross. So by working together with the local communities and other stakeholders, we were able to deploy a sustainable and practical solution that addresses real needs, reinforcing the value of the multi-stakeholder approach. 14 other similar projects have been implemented in countries in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe, supporting 70 primary and secondary schools and 8 universities for a total of about 140,000 students. Other applications include healthcare, telemedicine, and a wide range of new business opportunities. The initial engagements for some of these projects can be traced back directly to discussions that we had at the 2011 IGF in Nairobi. So this provides some pretty concrete examples of the value of the IGF, which is a unique and successful creation of the Tunis agenda. Others have addressed to how much it has grown and what value it has served. We absolutely believe that the IGF mandate must be renewed as part of this review process so these valuable interactions can continue. Turning our attention now to capacity building, which is a critical part of this dialogue, is the empowerment of the next generation with appropriate skills necessary for success in an information society. In response, Microsoft launched a Youth Spark program in 2012. As to results, as of the end of last year, via 30+ programs and partnerships with more than 350 youth-serving nonprofits, we have created new opportunities for more than 227 million young people in over 100 countries, including specific programs for girls, a network of innovation hubs that provide training, guidance, and resources to local entrepreneurs and developers. In developing these initiatives, we collaborated with local governments, civil society, nonprofits, and businesses globally and locally to understand the challenges that young people face, again, demonstrating the value of the multi-stakeholder process. Another important aspect of capacity building is addressing accessibility and inclusiveness, empowering all people regardless of age, ability, or language. Overall, about 1 billion people, or 15% of the world's population, have some form of disability, and 80% of them live in the developing world. We also embrace the multi-stakeholder approach here in our initiatives, including working with a school for blind students in Kenya, low-income populations with disability in Latin America, and accessible electronic voting machines. In 2013, we joined with the Broadband Commission for Digital Development, the Global Initiative for Inclusive Information and Communication Technologies, which some of you may know as G3ICT, the ITU, UNESCO, and others to jointly produce a report called the ICT Opportunity for Disability Inclusive Development Framework. G3ICT then produced a UNESCO report on WSIS progress relative to people with disabilities with very specific recommendations and call to actions for governments. So these are just a few examples of the impact of the multi-stakeholder approach, and hopefully provide you with some more practical examples of what this term means and how it can help to achieve meaningful results for the WSIS action lines. Each stakeholder contributes unique value, with government providing appropriate policy and regulatory frameworks to enable these achievements. These approaches, in addition to the value provided, can also enable more rapid integration of new technologies such as cloud, data analytics, and the Internet of Things, and more opportunities to leverage these innovations in a practical way to address real needs, while ensuring that issues such as human rights are also considered. These results affirm the vision of the Tunis agenda and the value of the action lines, and also clearly demonstrate that there is more work to do. The review process provides an important opportunity to recognize the progress that has been achieved, enabled by an open, secured, stable, resilient, and globally interoperable internet, but also to set a clear path to future realizations of the Sustainable Development Goals. Looking forward, we need to continue to leverage the multi-stakeholder approach to help create a holistic and enabling policy environment that will continue to promote sustained investment, as David and Matthew have mentioned, innovation, and enable the flow of information necessary to support development of ICT services and applications that can empower every person and every organization on the planet to reap the full potential of information society. New challenges will certainly need to be addressed as technology continues to evolve, and capacity building will need to incorporate these new challenges. There must also be a clear linkage between the WSIS action lines and the Sustainable Development Goals. As some of the issues raised above regarding gender equality, accessibility, and inclusiveness have been further developed in the SDGs, there should also be measurable goals. We will need participation, meaningful participation from all stakeholders, especially those from developing and least developed countries. Microsoft and others in the business community look forward to supporting this process and contributing value wherever we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. You're quite right to point to the important role of measurement in these things, and as Matthew said, that there's much more to this. We're actually reviewing the outputs and reviewing the performance against these goals. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask Laura DeNardis now to shift us out perhaps a little bit and look at some of the wider implications of the multi-stakeholder model itself, which is the underpinning to this particular review. Laura.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be attending the United States Internet Governance Forum and on this panel on WSIS+10. The +10 part is really interesting to me. 10 years is an eternity in Internet time. I think it's important to acknowledge that. Think about some of the things that have happened over the last 10 years. Around the time of Tunis, there was a new service called the Facebook, as it was called then, introduced at Harvard University. And on February 14th of that same year, the youtube.com domain name was activated. I believe we had the first United Nations report on the Internet of Things at that time. And on my front, I was finishing up putting the final touches on my doctoral dissertation on IPv6, which only this room can appreciate. But since then, we've had the rise of Twitter and Reddit and drones and Google glasses and, join in here, the iPhone and mobile access, the so-called Arab Spring, the Egyptian internet outage. I could go on and on and on. I have to include the Snowden NSA revelation. So everything has changed. The internet has grown to 3 billion. This will soon grow to 5 billion, with most of that growth in the developing world, with people accessing the internet from cell phones. So nothing is the same. Reviewing WSIS goals is inherently interesting because of that. It's backward looking, it's nostalgic, but it's also vitally important. There are completely new digital divides, I would say, from what we saw only 10 years ago. Not necessarily only based on access, but on the question of who gets to innovate, who gets to participate, who can afford connectivity, not just gain connectivity. And what counts as privacy and expression in the digital age is a debate alive and well, as we well know. But one theme that has stayed the same is the multi-stakeholder issue. This is something that has definitely been present for this entire time. And I think it's in some ways in this room and in our communities in which we travel, it's a norm, as Secretary Strickling said this morning. We can certainly have a critical stance around the ism part of it. I just wrote a paper called Multi-Stakeholder Ism, Anatomy of an Inchoate Global Institution, that looks theoretically at that and compares it to other forms of governance. So yes, I do use that word occasionally, tongue-in-cheek. But the one point that I'd like to make is that if you look at the totality of internet governance, it's many different functions, and we can't have the same type of governance for each of these functions. So there's not enough time to unpack that here, but there are layers and layers and layers of internet governance functions, and the same type of approach is not ideal for each of them. But if you look at the totality of it, it's vitally important for the different stakeholders to have some role if you look at the entirety. And the reason I say that is it seems obvious in this room, we can't take that for granted, that ideal for granted. I'll give you one example, just considering the terminology of the BRICS Summit Declaration that just came out this month. Have you had a chance to read through that? The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa Summit Declaration, in my opinion, uses some terminology that favors multilateralism rather than multi-stakeholder approaches. So it depends on the context. We can't take for granted that that is a norm. One of the quotes from there is, "We acknowledge the need to promote, among others, the principles of multilateralism, democracy, transparency, and mutual trust." So this is something that has to continually be promoted. I also want to suggest some contemporary challenges in multi-stakeholderism and particularly in internet governance that should be prominent in any WSIS+10 discussions. It's important that we not lose sight of the internet governance challenges. I would suggest that internet governance ranks among some other global collective action problems like environmental protection, human rights, countering terrorism, because it is the network that connects together not only our public sphere, but all of our industrial systems in our economic life. So it's vitally important. So some trends that I'm concerned about. One is the extent to which governments in the last 10 years have come to be co-opting infrastructures of internet governance for reasons completely having nothing to do with keeping the internet operational. Turning to private interconnection to cut off services, using denial of service attacks to silence dissident media. There's the turn to the domain name system for just about everything. Censorship, intellectual property rights enforcement, surveillance. We have now also the alarming specter of governments banning internet applications that embed end-to-end encryption. So this is the exact opposite of the permissionless innovation that was the zeitgeist at the time of WSIS +10. To me, this raises concerns about the collateral damage, not just to free expression, but to the internet itself. Another trend that I would like to suggest is the attempt to overlay national borders on the internet in a way that did not exist 10 years ago. There are tangible political movements to impose national borders over the internet, such as laws requiring data localization. This really has implications for the future of what counts as the internet, and these initiatives are real. Will we have a universal internet, or will we have a fragmented internet? A third trend is something near and dear to my heart. I've done a lot of writing on this subject: open standards. There is a resurgence of proprietary and content discriminatory approaches. The internet really has worked so well because of the open standards that Steve Crocker and Vinton Cerf talked about this morning. There's been a tension over the past decade between these open standards and more proprietary approaches that don't promote interoperability and that don't promote the same kind of competition. So these tensions have always existed, but I believe that this is an issue that should be a prominent feature in discussions. And then finally, the loss of trust and the need to restore trust has to be on the table. Is it possible to strike a meaningful balance between security and privacy? I believe that it is possible. I'm part of a global commission on internet governance that is doing a lot of work on that. But we do need a new approach and a new social compact in which citizens, governments, industry, and the internet technical community have the goal of restoring confidence in the internet in a way that protects personal privacy but also allows for the integrity of the network and the rule of law. So these are pretty big challenges ahead if you look at the contemporary problems. And paying attention to the internet governance challenges of today and tomorrow rather than 2005 is necessary to preserve the promise of the internet that we had in 2005. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, a powerful reminder of where we were 10 years ago and how much has happened. I wonder if I could just briefly pick up on the point that you take from the BRICS paper, and that might be something we talk about when we open the thing to the floor, and that is its support for multilateralism. And it's often thought that multi-stakeholderism is opposed to it. And the answer is that's not true at all. Being supportive of multi-stakeholderism does not mean that you oppose, in its right place, multilateralism. There's a perfectly good set of places where multilateral organizations have their place, and the same kind of comment can be found, and is often found at ICANN, that because governments are in an advisory role at ICANN, that somehow people at ICANN are opposed to the role of governments. These things aren't true at all. We have to be much more sophisticated, and what we have to do is develop the right techniques for the right place. And it's most of our view that multi-stakeholderism is appropriate in particular for this thing we call the internet. And that's for the kind of reasons that you've given, the speed of development and the things that Caroline's been talking about, the sort of the instantaneous global spread of the internet by comparison with other technologies. So that might be something we can come back to, is the role of multi-stakeholderism in this as opposed to multilateralism or other forms of governance. So thank you for that. So let's come after that then to another representative from civil society, Carolina. Carolina, can you tell us a little bit about what your groups and what civil society is doing in this particular exciting time that we find ourselves in?
Sure. I think I have two roles here. Is both talk a little bit about civil society, but one of the challenges that was posed to me during the panel organization was actually to think after 2015 and actually what that will mean for civil society engagement. Civil society has been active participating in the WSIS review process since its early beginning. Who was directly involved in meetings has varied depending on how we distribute resources. That's why we work in coalition, because we are very few. And while we have people covering WSIS, we had other people covering ITU, and now we have people covering Spectrum and W3C, so we have to divide and conquest. So it was very interesting to see that in core moments we could put some differences together on which groups believe more on multilateralism or multi-stakeholderism, on which of the systems and processes is a better expression of democracy, and we actually could come together to participate in some core consultation moments like the WSIS questionnaire in 2013, So we put forward as a Best Bits Coalition answers to that questionnaire that has not created any barriers for the individual groups who are there forever, like APC, to put their own position forward and things like that. So we, during the MEPP platform consultation, we also have participated on that through this coalition and so on. More recently, I think you guys have seen, and I've been tweeting some resources besides pictures of my panelists, my colleagues. Exactly where you find all these resources from civil society that, besides doing policy, are actually on the ground through grassroots networks, working on how you include people, how you do digital inclusion through this holistic framework. So in Brazil, I'm not known in this community by that, but I have founded a project in 2008 to spur the use of open educational resources. And we have been, through design thinking, teaching teachers and trainers and educators, and we have just trained like 2,000 teachers in Brazil on how you become an author, how you actually become part of this society. So through these grassroots platforms from APC, ISOC, and many others, we are just not doing policy, we are actually changing the market through projects like Microsoft has. One barrier that I think we all face, and I think this is a challenge for us in the next 10 years, is how we're gonna scale these projects, and maybe how we set clear collaboration links and exchange information to scale and not to repeat, because the resources are very few. So these are just examples of the participation of civil society, really always fighting for transparency, inclusion in the discussion, a real meaningful participation through multi-stakeholder processes. And I think my colleagues have covered well, and the fact that we had representatives on the 2nd. I was supposed to speak on the 1st of July in New York, and that has changed, but the 2nd was guaranteed for civil society. I think it's a proof that government is there to listen. And I think that's really important to recognize, because many folks from civil society has companies. We are here since the first WSIS, since 2003, which is very different from governments, because folks do rotate. In Brazil, for example, my country of origin, diplomats rotate every 3 or 5 years. So the knowledge gap, even being brilliant people, is there for some time. So I think it's very important for the other stakeholders bring that historical knowledge, so their learning curve is faster. So this is a little bit on the side of civil society engagement. I really want to focus now on the future. I think one of the biggest challenges for this community is actually to start breaking silos, breaking the silos of ICT and development. It sounds weird that I'm saying that, but actually there is a silo. If you actually look into the documents that are now the core foundation for the social development goals, ICT is mentioned in very few words and in very few of the supportive documents and mechanisms for the implementation of the social development goal. That just changed with the expert meeting in June in Geneva, where folks did that chart where ICT, the action lines of WSIS, feed into SDG, but that's new, that just happened. And that's really shocking for me to see that that has not happened. But so as you guys know, talking a little bit what's going to happen after 2015. In 2016, the Millennium Development Goals will be substituted by this post-2015 agenda, which now have been calling the Social Development Goals. But what is, Sustainable Development Goals. But what is sustainable development? And that's very important, because if you observe even the conferences that we go to, the folks that goes to ICT4D are not the folks in general that go to IGF. And that is just a very simple example of the silos of the community and the knowledge generated. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It contains within it two key concepts: the concept of needs, in particular the essential need of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given, and the idea of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization to the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. Climate change was finally recognized within that second piece. And I think finally we have recognized ICT has a great part of both pieces. And the Millennium Development Goals have been the key force shaping the international development agenda since early 2000s. It is argued that the same will be true for the post-2015 agenda. However, the WSIS review seems to be, it seems that the narrative was broken in two paths, the WSIS review and the WSIS vision for the WSIS beyond 2015. It's very interesting to it's actually confusing to understand all the different parallel processes that are happening here, and we are trying to map for you and to engage to. But based on the international narrative, but mostly important, the international funding, the SDGs are actually much more urgent and important for the international community than our ICT space. The billions dedicated to the SDGs by international philanthropy and government is uncomparable to what's dedicated to WSIS actions line. So I think it's really important to understand that a lot of times the funding and the priority at the level of the executive will determine the willingness of governments to actually move and implement things forward. So to understand these silos, the silos that exist in the narrative is really important to understand, will the action lines actually be implemented and how and for what? So a couple of examples just to illustrate a little bit clearly what I'm saying. So poverty was central to the MDG agenda and remains central for the post-2015 agenda. Yet after sustainability, it's the second most comparatively underrepresented in terms of ICT 4D and WSIS, if you look at the bibliography and the documents that support these both negotiation processes. So one example. And I think, and in its beginning, if you were there in 2003, WSIS process was aimed at identifying ways to use technology to improve people's lives. That was always the core goal. But I think that a lot of us felt that during this past 10 years, process issues became the focus, like how IGF will operate, is this multilateral, multi-stakeholder? And I think sadly, if you were here this morning, you saw the example of the math club in the opening session, right? It's stuck for a year because of process issues. And I do believe that we had a lot of advancements, but I do believe that WSIS stayed stuck in a lot of process issues rather than substantive issues. And I really hope that now, with this clear linkage of the SDGs with the WSIS action lines, we're finally gonna move in a right direction. And I hope that civil society and the business sectors and the academia sector, we are there to keep calling the attention for that and to ensure that this agenda is priority for the highest levels of the executives, of the governments involved. So I think this is a little bit one of the scenarios, and I'm very afraid that if this clear linkage and priority is not given, even if we have to pick and choose which action lines are central or not, we may see just another 10 years of just focusing process and not substance. And I think that our kids should not be subject to that in the next 10 to 20 years. And I think it's really imperative that governments have that very clear and take the responsibility of really fulfilling their commitments to inclusion through access and broadband plans, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a little bit the scenario.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And thanks also for that passionate call about silo breaking. I think that's one of the most important things we can address, and also obviously the point you make about linking the Sustainable Development Goals with the action lines. So we've talked about a number of countries. I managed to get a mention of New Zealand in. We heard from Brazil. We've had trips to other foreign countries. This is, after all, the IGF of the USA. So let's finish by bringing it home. And we've got Marian Gordon from your US State Department to tell us a little bit about the role that the State Department is playing in some of these debates. And hopefully, Marian, a bit of a call to action. If we manage to get some excitement in the room, how can people engage in the US process?
Thank you, Peter. Well, it's my pleasure to be here to say the following. that the United States is very pleased that non-governmental stakeholders will participate in the WSIS +10 high-level meeting and its preparatory process. Stakeholders from industry, civil society, academia, and the technical community have been fundamental to the success of WSIS implementation, and they deserve to have prominent voices in the 10-year review. As has been said, I think even within the last hour or so, the United States government has worked very hard last year during negotiations on the modalities for the WSIS +10 review to secure non-governmental participation. We faced resistance from some other member states in securing this important opportunity. For those who are not perfectly expert, just let me repeat perhaps once more to make it simple. The agreed process for WSIS +10 review now includes intergovernmental negotiations led by 2 co-facilitators, UN ambassadors from the United Arab Emirates and Latvia, as well as, of course, multi-stakeholder consultation. Multi-stakeholder consultations will be convened by the President of the General Assembly. Regarding participation, participation at the intergovernmental negotiations will be more restrictive than at the multi-stakeholder consultations. That said, some non-governmental stakeholders that already have standing with the UN Economic and Social Council will be able to attend as observers. I'm happy to tell you also that intergovernmental negotiations will be streamed so that there will be some transparency. The multi-stakeholder consultations, of course, are more inclusive and will include all relevant WSIS stakeholders. Stakeholders will also be allowed, as has been said, and I think it's important to say this at least once more, to make written inputs into the preparatory process. And representatives of relevant WSIS stakeholders will be allowed to speak during the high-level meeting in December. Much has been said of the timetable. All of you have it, I think, perhaps have a timetable. I do. I'm happy to share. It's our hope that the stakeholder community will take advantage of the opportunities to engage in the WSIS +10 process where appropriate. Obviously, we wish there was even more stakeholder dialogue and collaboration during the WSIS +10 review, but we believe that the President of the General Assembly and the co-facilitators are working very hard to incorporate all relevant voices into the process and outcome. We also encourage all stakeholders to continue to actively participate in WSIS stakeholder meetings that are organized by the State Department under our advisory group processes to prepare for the WSIS +10 high-level meeting in December. These meetings allow the United States government to form its position in tactical planning for the high-level meeting, informed by stakeholder views and information that they are willing to share, that you all are willing to share. Since I have you as an audience here, let me tell you that the next meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday from 9:30 to 11, and I would encourage all to attend. If you have an interest in attending and you don't know about it, just come and find me. I'm happy to tell you where it is and what we'll be talking about. And I'm also happy to report that Ambassador Sepulveda, who will be leading the preparatory process for the United States, will be attending. It's been said before, but it's worth saying again, that we're committed in the United States government to continuing the important and useful dialogue and collaboration between the government and broader stakeholder community throughout the WSIS +10 process, and we look forward to hearing about your concerns and priorities, not only at this opportunity, but at all of the opportunities that we have from here to December. And as I say, including all of the multi-stakeholder meetings that we're conducting here in Washington for those who are U.S. based. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was excellent to hear Julie talking about the same kind of things at a global level that the US State Department is doing. And it's even more exciting, I think, to see that the US government is walking the walk and talking the talk of multi-stakeholder in the consultation process. And so there's the process in action. If you want to get involved, go to those meetings and contribute. And the timetable here that's available at the back of the room has the how and the why and the where. Okay, well, thank you all panelists for giving some very stimulating thoughts and throwing them into a really interesting mix. So we're going to open the microphone in the usual way. If you'd like to speak, please come, announce your name and affiliation if you have one. Don't be ashamed if you haven't. But what we don't allow is anonymous input. It can be unaffiliated. And while I was getting my coffee, I thought Vinny Markovsky said he wanted to ask a question. Or is Vinny here? Where's Vinny? I have to introduce Vinny because he's the former president of ISOC Bulgaria, which is one of the more interesting countries. There's been a coup, Vinny. There's been a coup. And of course, is now Vice President ICANN for engagement with the UN and other similar bodies. Vinny.
Thank you. Maybe New Zealand special services know something that I don't know. And I'm gonna stay here so that I'm not facing with I'm not turning my back towards anybody. So yes, I am the Vice President of ICANN, responsible for the UN engagement and based in New York. And thank you for the organization of this panel discussion. But the thing that, and I know David, by the way, we've met way back when I was on the Bulgarian governmental delegation. This was the first experiment where governments were bringing civil society representatives to a governmental meeting, and there are some fascinating memories from that time. Like, for example, that we were not supposed to speak. The foreign ministry official deliberately told me when she left me in that room with the governmental officials, you're not supposed to speak. And by the way, it was 2003, Bulgaria was candidate for the EU. Whatever the EU says, you would say, yes, we agree with that. So just to make you a little bit, kind of wake you up a little bit maybe, because it's late in the afternoon now. But when she came the next day, she entered the room when Markus Kummer, who is now on the ICANN board, back then he was chairing this meeting, was thanking me for the participation I had in this discussion, and she was shocked. She thought she's going to be fired. She thought that the European Commission representative, the European Union, would send a letter to Bulgaria to complain about this young guy back then. And it turned out that I was the only person with technical background who could actually explain to the diplomats what the internet is. And they didn't know. And by the way, the creation of the working group on internet governance was because there was no understanding what this thing is. So 12 years further, and coming to today's WSIS +10 discussion at the UN diplomats are where the Geneva diplomats were 12 years ago. In other words, they are not really familiar with the internet. They are discussing very high-level items on, and then think about the fact that the internet, the WSIS, compared to nuclear proliferation, war in the Middle East, poverty, you call it, disasters, this is nothing. WSIS is like nothing. It's big for the people in this room. It may be big for some of the diplomats who are engaged now in this process, but for the UN as a whole, WSIS is coming in December, so there is time until then. This is one thing. And second, well, yes, there is the SDG summit in September. There is a climate summit in Paris. There is, if you will, UNESCO General Conference. You know, there are so many events in between that people are not really thinking this is as important as we, the people here, believe. And the second thing is they really need a lot of information. So what I do, for example, when I go and meet with governments, be that on bilateral meetings or in workshops that we help organizing, it's provide them the information, tell them how the internet works. That's why today, this morning, when Vint and Steve Crocker were talking about the history of the internet, I found this fascinating, and I think it will be good for the diplomats to hear it, because it explains also why the internet needs this model of multi-stakeholder governance. Why it's not really how the governments tell you what to do and it has to be done. It answers also to questions to some diplomats which they have asked, for example, well, why don't the UN takes over? And it answers to questions which other countries have said, well, why not the ITU have a veto power over the ICANN board decisions? and stuff like that. So when they hear the history, I think, and when they hear engineers talking about, I think Carolina mentioned it, about the math club. This is a fascinating story. If a UN diplomat hears that they wasted 1 year in creating the framework and not doing anything, they'll say, oh, that's, it's normal. For the people who have done the internet since the beginning, it's something quite different. Anyway, to go back to the questions, I think my question would be probably for the current US State Department official, not the previous one. I knew it, David actually sent me an email saying if you ask a question, ask Marian, not me.
Did you say that?
That's somebody who counts.
And he is an ambassador, so I have to listen, community member. No, the question is, there is and this is an observation which have happened in July 1st and 2nd. Like China publicly announced that they support the IANA transition and the ICANN multi-stakeholder model at the UN. India has announced also a shift in position from the big, countries. It's kind of only Russia, South Africa from the BRICS ones, which are still kind of not quite certain where they are. But what do you think would be the best way to approach every country? Because it shouldn't be approaching only the BRICS countries. It should be approaching everyone. We have here, as ISOC Bulgaria, other ISOC chapters, you have Kathy Brown, there are more than 100 chapters. Do you think there is a way for us as community members, as ICANN community members, as internet society, businesses, etc., to approach governments around the world to explain to them what this whole thing with the WSIS is and why it's important, preserve the model, etc., etc.?
Marian, having been targeted for that question.
Well, this is just another opportunity for me to invite everyone who, as I say, is U.S. based, to come to the stakeholder meetings that we have, so that these kinds of issues can be treated in more detail. One of the things that that we talk about in these meetings is how we can effectively present our positions at the really in many different fora, but certainly we're talking now about the high-level meeting. So I think this is a subject that deserves some further conversation, and I would, this is an opportunity too. We began this conversation by saying that there were so many luminaries around the room. If there are others who have some ideas as to whether how to achieve what Benny was talking about and how to do it in the time frame of the end of the year, certainly perhaps we could that would be something that we could open the discussion to.
Thanks. Well, speaking of luminaries, a good time to actually acknowledge Elia Armstrong, who's here from the UN, from that part of the UN that does the support of many of these agencies that are actually engaged, including the IGF. So by all means, you are very welcome, and if at any stage you wanted to comment, including to augment or help explain, obviously this is one of the silos that we can see being broken down as we sit here. Sorry, was there somebody? Matthew.
Can I just comment on?
Please do.
Just a general comment. I think that one of the things we need to do is think less defensively about the success that's happened since WSIS 2005. Think less defensively about the multi-stakeholder model. This morning we heard Larry Strickling talk about 3 multi-stakeholder national level processes that were going to be rolled out in the US. We talk about, in the spaces of the WSIS, we talk about the IGF and ICANN as being examples of multi-stakeholder. But that's not really where the battle and where we need to be focused on. We need to be focused on what's happening at the national level in the US, in the UK, around the world, how successful that's been, how successful has innovation and entrepreneurship been in countries around the world since 2005, how important has been an enabling environment and competition been to that. So we're always on the back foot on this, in this space. We really need to be telling people about the successes, about the things that we've accomplished and the things that have been done, and focus more about what can we identify at the national level that are our success stories.
David, you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me, of course, endorse that, and let me pile on for a moment. I mean, going back, and Laura's touched on this, others have as well, take a snapshot of 2005 and a snapshot of today. And from a policy perspective, the prescription that we put together and talked about in 2003 and 2005 has not been a success. It has been an extraordinary, radical, historic change success. The number of people who have used technology to get out of dire, extreme poverty is unprecedented in human history. The ability of people to communicate, to have access to knowledge since 2005 is unprecedented in human history. The enabling environment that we talked about has borne fruit, has helped those that we talked about from a development perspective in 2003 and 2005 in an extraordinary way. Politically, it has, one can argue on the margins of it, but it has really changed the whole debate. You know, Kathy Brown talked at lunch today and has talked before about collaborative governance. You know, I think part of the problem here is we may get ourselves a little too wedded to terminology like multi-stakeholder, which sort of has its own baggage now and is very hard to explain to anybody, including myself. But you know, the concept of collaborative, I want to endorse, because I think people sort of have a viscerally better feel about that somehow you work together, not a question of trying to everybody come and everybody gets an equal say. So I think we can sort of work on those things, but I agree with Matthew that there is no reason to be defensive. And let me also quickly say, that's no reason just because we don't need to be defensive that it isn't going to be a difficult process, because these benefits are not universally applauded. It will be very difficult. Daniel's going to have a hard time working through these things. This is not going to be an easy process, but it's one in which I think everybody ought to be very proud about.
Absolutely. Carolyn.
Just to add on to what David and Matthew had been saying, I think that in many ways we talk about the process, and I think it was Carolina who talked about the need to focus on a substance instead of on the process. The term of collaborative approaches towards this, and then so moving the conversation away from the process to focus on the end result, so that I believe that if a national government can look at what are some of the economic benefits, the educational benefits, and some of the other social benefits that are delivered through this collaborative approach, we can move the conversation towards a different level rather than just is multi-stakeholderism better than multilateralism. So that's just a plea to.
I think is the
Very helpful. We certainly have, we have great results to focus on, and we don't want to get taken down into either a semantic sort of rat hole or any kind of particular process rat hole. Well, let's come to the floor. Marilyn.
Thank you. My name is Marilyn Cade. A few years ago, I was one of those people from the business sector who had a very big challenge because I managed to get myself to Geneva during the first preparatory process. And I even managed to get myself into the Palais, but I couldn't manage to get myself into the room. So I had to justify to my boss at the time, Woody Kirkeslager from AT&T, why I was flying to Geneva and hanging out and having coffee with diplomats for weeks at a time. And I want to thank the governments who are in the room today, because there are many governments who are here, as well as UNGA and Ambassador Gross and the U.S. government, Marian, but other colleagues, about the work that you have continued to do to help us change the modality so that actually more government policymakers, people who are elected to worry about clean water and climate, or they're appointed to deal with building roads or dams, those people are now beginning to talk our language, and I think we need to also start talking their language. One of my biggest challenges when I used to call the press during the two preparatory processes was to get anybody interested in talking about internet governance. I think we should take this opportunity as a window of opportunity we have between now and December to really activate our own understanding and to talk to more and more government policymakers at a national level. So I have a concrete suggestion. Here in this room, and at the IGF-USA are many NGOs and many businesses and many ICT associations who have contacts at a national level. We have almost 50 national and regional IGFs now to build on. Perhaps we could think about what can we do to activate those networks so that more people at a national level feel knowledgeable enough to go in and meet with their government ministry, not just the telecom ministry, but the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Economic Development. If we look at it as a window of opportunity, I really agree with comments that have been made, then we do need to tell our success stories as well.
Thank you, Marilyn. Any response from the panel? Any other?
I just have
Carolyn.
a quick comment. It's related to the previous comments. I think at the end, like if folks here, and I'm sure you did study like cooperation theory and prisoner's dilemma and all that, if we don't move towards with collaboration, and Yochai Benkler has been working a lot on that for the past couple of years, 5 years or more, and mapping a lot of state cases on that. And I think the Berkman Center with the other nucleus, who have mapped a bunch of multi-stakeholderism style projects around the world, if you go to the details of it, it's all about cooperation and understanding that there is a bigger goal, and then process end up not mattering that much. So it was just a comment, and I think that the collaboration, understanding what Marilyn was saying, is exactly into that direction. If we want to implement successful projects and have a common language, the final goal of development should be what actually moves us towards this process and the implementation of the action lines.
Thanks. Ilya, if you wanted to make a comment, please do. From the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Ilya E. Armstrong. I learned to say this from Marilyn Cade. To state your name and where you're from the United Nations, Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I'd like to thank very much the organizers of IGF-USA for extending the invitation, a very warm welcome. And I have to say that it has been a very fruitful and rich day for me, and I think the value, of course, is to listen to all the views. I'd like to also, of course, acknowledge, and I was joking earlier, the masters that we serve. Daniel is here, who also supports one of the ambassadors, who is the co-facilitators. So I've been listening very carefully to, you know, your cries for how can we be actively involved and how can we make our voices heard and how can we get our concerns on this agenda, and if you would permit me to feel a little bit removed from the multilateral process. So I was thinking about this, and I thought, well, the United Nations is an arena for all voices from around the world to be heard. And how can we ensure that those voices from the South are heard? And we heard, there was a reminder that the original goal of WSIS was about the deployment of ICTs for development. And now the world, at the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, is at a crossroads and coming up with a collective vision, a visioning of back to those original fundamental goals. And regardless of whether ICTs is explicitly mentioned or not, it seems to me that the SDGs and that the grander vision will not be possible without ICTs. So this comes back to the point that how do we give voices, the voices of the South to be heard? And if you could find a way to reach out to ensure that that happens, and then we can incorporate them into the processes. Now, you heard a little bit about the roadmap. Yes, there are these face-to-face meetings, but we are also working on remote participation. There is the submissions process. And if there could be, I think from what I've heard from the State Department, this reaching out by the national governments to the other stakeholders, and to try to get a sense of that, if that model could also be encouraged in other countries without in any way trying to play down the importance of multi-stakeholderism for whatever it is, however you define it. And perhaps I would also suggest not to lightly throw away the model of multilateralism also. It was once upon a time an innovation of its own kind and did serve a very important purpose. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you again for your invitation.
Thank you very much, and we certainly welcome all of those comments and look forward to ways of extending that cooperation that's already underway and looks like continuing. Anyone from the panel? We've got 10 more minutes, so there's room for, if there's not another question, I don't see anybody, let's have some closing thoughts from the panel. Perhaps go in reverse order than we started.
No, I just finished a moment ago. Everything's fresh and everything's on.
This is not a compulsory, this is an optional. Carolyn?
Sure, so in closing, first of all, I mean, I think that as others have said already, we have an opportunity to contribute and make clear what are the specific results. I very much agree and concur with Marilyn's call to actions, and furthermore would like to put in a plug for the IGF intersessional work on policy options for connecting the next billion as another opportunity and effort to make a collection of very practical examples of collaborative approaches in ICT supporting the WSIS action lines and subsequently the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's an important conversation for us to get through and just to get practical examples out there.
Yes, can I just pick up on that point? If people aren't aware of it, there's a lot of intercessional work. In other words, not just at the annual IGF. There's a lot of other opportunities for people to get involved in the IGF work, including just one of the 6, a new one on trying to prevent abuse of women online. And these are things that are running all year and culminating, so you don't have to just go to the annual IGF to participate. Laura.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the comments and find it to be a very productive discussion. I want to respond to something that Vaini said that I found very interesting. And he was saying that some in the United Nations community don't think of the internet as important as some of the other issues like climate change and human rights. And I know Vaini doesn't believe that, and I just want to come down strongly against that. Imagine not being able to access a bank account. Imagine not being able to access healthcare in parts of the world. Imagine if entire industries stop functioning because the internet goes down. This is part of a situation where we sometimes take the internet for granted. And if we take the internet for granted, how much more do we take internet governance for granted? This thing doesn't just run itself. It's very complicated. Think about the domain name system alone, resolving hundreds of billions of queries a day in a complicated distributed system involving multiple institutions. There are buildings. The internet is not just a cloud. There are buildings with Coke machines and people and institutions. And I want to just put a plug in for not taking this for granted, because tying it in with the other excellent intervention, so happy to have someone from the United Nations here. I think this point of tying it together with the deployment of ICTs is a very important one. And I want to emphasize that if the internet does not continue to have a stable system of internet governance, we will not have the kinds of benefits from ICTs that we've been able to have in the last 10 years. So I encourage the discussion to come outside of the dialogue, because the internet governance takes place while we're having this discussion. So come out of the dialogue and focus on things such as the problems with data localization, the problems with putting national borders over the internet, and other kinds of concerns. So I'm excited to be part of this panel, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Matthew.
Just a further thought, when we're thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, these aren't anything new. These challenges have been with us for decades, if not longer than that. What we have to show, what we need to show, is that ICTs are absolutely fundamental to moving forward and being able to meet these challenges head on. And I think the more that we can do that, the more that we bridge between the WSIS and the SDGs, the more productive we'll see, the more engagement we'll see on internet governance issues, and the more we'll see in terms of economic development. We resolve some of these challenges, we'll see a bounce in economic development. So really pinpointing how ICTs, innovation, entrepreneurship can solve issues of sanitation, issues of poverty and education, I think is key for us over the next 6 months and post-2015. Thanks.
Absolutely. Pointing out how it affects the bottom line is another good way of attracting people's attention, isn't it? Carolina.
No, and just to bring another pepper to the debate, another spicy here. And internet's so important that now the trade machine has taken up to protect the open internet, right? So if you see all the trade agreements, and that was debated already in the panel earlier today, trade is a big vehicle for internet regulation nowadays. I've been mapping the past 10 years of bilaterals and multilaterals, and the expansion qualitatively and quantitatively of internet-related norms is incredible. Has it happened with IP the decade before? And if we are not attentive to that, that can be a weight that unbalance the equilibrium we would like to see for sustainability and poverty. I think trade is extremely important, but those sustainable development goals are also important. And if we keep those things separated, we may have some chilling effects down the road.
Okay, thank you. And David, you started us off brilliantly. You get a chance to close us out.
Well, I don't know about the brilliant part, but let me just maybe continue on the theme of not being shy and to be proud and to be thinking creatively and new. Building on change, I think, is one of the approaches we can take here. You know, back when I first had the opportunity to get very involved with the United Nations on this issue, I had the honor of being on the UN's ICT task force, which then Secretary General Kofi Annan put together. That was a group from industry, civil society, and governments all together to work on these issues. He put that together because, as was pointed out by Vinny and by others, policymakers, diplomats, and others really were without a clue as to what the internet and the impact could be. That was true all the way through 2003, and less so even in 2005, where it was unclear what the relationship between this unique technology would be and all of the other issues that the UN deals with. You know, the UN deals with whether it's development, peace, whether it deals with the issue of economic change, whether it deals with the environment. The technology we're talking about is now part of the DNA of all of those solutions. So I worry less about trying to convince everyone to make sure that the term ICT is everywhere. I think we've gone beyond that. And the key is to build, in my view, is to go beyond that as well. Not to say no, which is sort of often a knee-jerk reaction, to whether it's a discussion at the UN, whether it's a discussion within with governments, whether it's a discussion within our communities, but rather think creatively about ways in which we can move the process forward. It's really about saying yes and figuring out how it works for everyone. We have an opportunity, because my belief is that as extraordinary as the impact has been over the last 10 years, the next 10 to 20 years will make the first 10 years look absolutely like there was nothing going on. And the key is to use that to convince governments and multilateral organizations to allow the future to happen and not to build in rules and regulations and approaches to retard that. That's not easy to do, but it seems to me that it's incredibly important. I think the opportunity that the co-facilitators and the President of the General Assembly has given to the multi-stakeholder environment here to participate fully is extraordinary, is something to be grabbed. The group that one of the groups that I'm very involved with, the Internet Governance Coalition, has already filed its comments. We didn't wait for July 31st. I encourage others to do the same, in part because that way you don't have to read them all at the same time. And to try to show enthusiasm, move things forward. I don't think this is something to be feared. It's in fact something to be embraced. I think the future is extraordinarily good, and to have the UN be a forum for those discussions is something that should, and I think will, benefit all of us.
Thank you, Dave. All right, well, that brings us to an end. We're out of time. Please join with me in thanking this absolutely extraordinary, gender-balanced and technically qualified panel. Thank you all for coming. But before we go, please also join me in thanking the organisers of this panel, Marilyn, Cade, who's been for a long time the catalyst of the USIGF, put a lot of work into this, as did her colleague Judith Hellerstein. Marilyn, thank you, and Judith, you did a great job. Thank you all. Thank you. You guys did all the work. Laura, Benny is crossing you about something. You just quite. Hey, how's it going?
Thank you for the announcement. I was like, uh-oh, I dropped off the list again.
That's a good example of where
Images.
they all struggled.
And then look what, yeah,
And then
exactly.
the internet showed up to the point and it
Took off.
and it took off.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
Forget about it.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. History is an important guide to that. That's terrific. No, I think I will. I'll use it.